Welcome to District Deep Dive, where we take a look at the history, culture, and political climate of each of Panem's 13 districts. Today, we'll be taking a closer look at District 13, Panem's graphite and nuclear production center, thought for 75 years to have been destroyed in the First Rebellion. While District 13 does not directly appear on the most popular maps of Panem, the district is comprised of parts of Quebec, Ontario, and New York, and is sequestered in the northeasternmost region of the map. Like District 5's dams and District 10's cattle ranches, the district's export is one intrinsically tied into its location. Significant graphite deposits have been historically found within upstate New York and Ontario's Lake Huron. But far more importantly, there is a wide and varied arsenal of buildings, resources, and tools used to process nuclear technologies. Ontario alone has 18 CANDU reactors, with close to 60% of the city's electrical power being provided by nuclear energy. Although it's almost guaranteed that not each and every reactor survived by the time that Panem was founded, logically, given this specific export, it's highly plausible District 13 had at least a baseline to build off of. Graphite mining in of itself, although used as a cover-up to mask the district's role as a nuclear weapons production center, is essential in producing and maintaining nuclear reactors, meaning both industries feed into the other. Now, it's clearly established throughout the books that a district's wealth has next to nothing to do with how essential their export is to maintaining human life. The food production districts, 9, 10, and 11, are famously among Panem's most impoverished. However, if there is one area the capital has repeatedly shown themselves to be willing to invest a significant amount of money in, it's their military and propaganda units. District 2 is among Panem's wealthiest as the sector the capital recruits the most soldiers from, meaning that while they were under capital reign, it's highly probable District 13 could have counted themselves amongst these wealthier sectors. In order to properly maintain the reactors themselves, the capital would have had to heavily invest in 13's infrastructure, let alone the money that may have potentially been poured into proper laboratory equipment, testing sites, and so forth. It's also an export that hints that 13 may have previously had a uniquely high standard of education when compared to that of the other districts, as nuclear assembly would by default require a large number of trained personnel. Although we've next to no information on what life prior to the First Rebellion looked like within District 13, from their culture to their traditions to the actual number of people that resided within the district itself, we can at least infer their district would have been well valued by the capital, and that amongst the other 12 districts, they would have likely had a uniquely high standard of living, especially given they were the epicenter of military operations. However, it's worth noting that just because a district may be a bit wealthier than others does not mean that wealth is distributed equally amongst every member. Even the most impoverished districts are divided into strict classes. Same for the wealthy. For instance, District 2 is divided between a poverty-stricken, destitute stonecutter class and military employees that are conferred a wide degree of benefits and financial support by comparison. It's unquestionable that District 13 would be similarly split, the most likely scenario being division between graphite miners, the manual laborers that do the dirty, underpaid work the rest of their district is dependent on but doesn't value, and nuclear scientists, engineers, and technicians that produce the complex technologies the capital desires. Yet it's even further worth addressing that whatever district wealth is accumulated is pennies in comparison to the capital's excess, and that even the richest members of individual districts traditionally want for basic goods and necessities. 13, despite being marginally better off than its neighbors, is still in a desperate, awful position at the start of Panem's First Rebellion. On account of history being written by its victors, the books contain markedly little information on what started the First Rebellion, but a detailed account of what happened within it. For the first 3 years of the rebellion, District 13 fought alongside the other 12 districts within a consolidated and united front, and played an essential role in arming them against capital forces as the district that produced the bulk of the capital's weapon arsenal. Although the alliance's casualties were high, with 2 rebel insurgents dying for every capital soldier, for the first 3 years of the war, there was the real, seemingly reachable possibility they'd secure victory, with them successfully laying siege to the capital for at least 2 years of the rebellion. However, despite the rebels outnumbering the capital and having, at least at the start of the war, weapons relatively on par with theirs, the capital's natural fortification made outright military invasion difficult, if not impossible, and the longer the siege progressed, the more scarce fresh weapons, soldiers, and supplies grew. This war of attrition on both ends ultimately culminated in a catastrophic attempted capital raid that left the rebel alliance with losses so extreme that District 13 came to the terrible conclusion the war was unwinnable. Yet intriguingly, their acknowledgement the war was unwinnable didn't mean District 13 had resigned themselves to defeat. In secret, they launched a last-ditch effort to secure a significant portion of the capital's nuclear arsenal, likely already having at least a crude idea of where the weapons were stored and how to securely and swiftly transfer them as the district most directly responsible for the original transport of said arsenal. Once safely obtained, 13 directly threatened to bomb the capital, aware the capital also had a separate weapon stockpile beyond their reach. And there, under the threat of mutually assured destruction, a tentative and treacherous peace was brokered. 13 would be allowed to secede from Panem and live as its own independent nation, under the condition they feigned their own destruction and retreated underground. The biggest question that is asked in regards to this betrayal is why 13 didn't utilize this threat to broker the safety of every district, or at least a series of terms that could have laid the groundwork for their future reunion. Wouldn't it be better to risk total annihilation when a district citizen's life under the capital's regime was hardly a life at all? The answer is an uncertain one. You could pose a convincing argument that even in the most desolate and desperate of circumstances, people will still find some form of joy to cling to and strive towards. You could further pose the claim that 13 might have sincerely held the belief that allowing even one district to escape the consequences of surrendering would provide the remaining districts their best possible chance at having a second opportunity to unite. If you happen to be feeling particularly cynical, you could veer in the opposite direction and deem all District 13 power-hungry opportunists that forsook anything that no longer served them. Their rationale ultimately doesn't matter in the grand scheme of things. All that does is the consequences, and the many of the people they abandoned suffered for 75 years. Although I don't entirely doubt the possibility the war was genuinely unwinnable at the point the stunt was pulled, District 13's betrayal is what unquestionably wound up condemning their comrades. The remaining 12 districts were operating under the impression their greatest and strongest allies had been completely and utterly destroyed, and that a similar destruction awaited them in the event they continued to resist. Bear in mind, District 13's infrastructure wasn't a series of small, hastily constructed shacks. It was virtually guaranteed to have been a highly industrialized urban city, and likely among Panem's most impressive in that regard. To the 12 districts that comprised the remainder of the rebel alliance, the bombing of District 13 communicated the message that if the strongest of their numbers could be eradicated with ease, so could they. And setting aside just mere demoralization, in retreating in this fashion, District 13 stripped their allies of whatever meager weapons they may have still had. Yet despite the consequences this event yields, District 13 doesn't appear to harbor any sort of cultural guilt regarding it by the time that we reach the events of Mockingjay. But this could be in large part due to the fact the average District 13 citizen's largest and most immediate concern is their own survival over reminiscing over the past. Although the bunkers they retreat into are sturdy enough to withstand bombings with relatively little damage, the bunkers themselves are not naturally self-sustaining, with District 13's ability to survive being contingent on every member's willingness to make their quarters survivable. That means unending maintenance with no obvious, easy, or efficient way of replacing unreplenishable resources. In order to ensure total compliance from their civilian population, District 13 operates as a stratocracy that masquerades as a democracy. For those unfamiliar, a stratocracy is a government headed by military chiefs, and where all branches of government are subsequently administered by various military personnel. In short, what you could easily argue is a military dictatorship. What's particularly sinister about District 13's stratocracy is they still commonly utilize titles we'd associate with a traditional democracy. And yet, reading between the lines, there's nothing democratic about the way these officials are elected. They are headed by a president, but there is next to no information given on the way these elections are conducted. And once elected, there appear to be no term limits or even outright terms. Their justice system is exclusively military courts, even for what are clearly civilian cases. There are innumerable instances of powerful enough figureheads making fairly major decisions on behalf of the entire district without consulting any sort of panel or even the citizenry themselves. The citizenry themselves are drafted after the age of 14, and every citizen has a highly specific, predetermined list of tasks that must be completed by day's end lest they risk punishment. Despite District 13 condemning the capital, they've ironically constrained their citizens in an identical fashion. At the start of each day, every District 13 citizen is quite literally branded with an unchangeable and unamendable schedule. Although it's adjusted a certain amount of consideration is given in terms of assigning tasks according to skill, the citizens aren't conferred any element of choice. They have no freedom of movement, literally or socially, without attempting to advance military ranks. Even the most insignificant, minor aspects of their lives are strictly regulated, from the food they consume to the exact space they consume it within. And yes, although you could pose the argument this is a lifestyle born of necessity over a desire to maintain totalitarian control, even in these insanely dire circumstances, there are still a certain degree of choices the citizenry can partake in. Maybe they wouldn't be able to pick the precise job of their dreams, but they could be offered at least a range of acceptable options. But as they are, the average citizen of District 13 is just as personally and emotionally constrained as a district citizen living under capital rule. What's most disturbing about this structure is the incredible contradiction within it. District 13 is perceived as being a collectivist culture, but upon examining the most common social dynamics the district enacts, they ironically appear to be collectivists without community. All social events, from daily mealtimes to district-wide assemblies, are structured around reaffirming their roles as merely part of a larger machine. There is considerably little care extended towards society's most vulnerable members, and every person they encounter is exclusively worth whatever they can potentially contribute to their ultimate goals. Citizens of this district are taught exclusively to prioritize the goals of the district above literally all else, their lives and that of their loved ones included. Even the way their limited free time is structured is done in a fashion to minimize the intensity of whatever familial bonds may be shared between members, as citizens only receive 30 minutes a day to communicate and reflect alongside them. District 13 also has a pervasive concept of collective violent punishment that mirrors the type utilized within the capital on multiple occasions. Take, for instance, the plight of Katniss's prep team. Although not truly utilized in the movies, in Mockingjay, Katniss's prep team functionally assumes the role that Effie Trinket did. Like Effie, they are capital-born and deliriously out of touch, but Katniss extends them deference that you'd otherwise extend children. In her eyes, they are ridiculous and gaudy and over the top, but have no true malice to them, and she grows remarkably fond of them as a result. Prior to his execution in Catching Fire, Cinna had interceded to ensure his prep team would escape to aid Katniss after her own, accurately perceiving them as the capital's next most natural targets. Yet Katniss's prep team doesn't find any form of solace or security within District 13, because at the point that she finds them, they're described as having been harshly chained up, stripped of their clothing and beaten to the point they were unrecognizable, with her only being able to identify them through their facial tattoos and other body modifications. Bear in mind, these are characters that literally have dyed skin. One of them is green, meaning their bruising must have been to the point that it was near disfiguring. Enraged, Katniss demands to know why people that pose no legitimate threat to anyone are being held in such deplorable conditions, only to discover that that is the punishment for stealing a single slice of bread in District 13. This is the first insight Katniss receives into the severity of the measures that Coin is willing to employ if she is not obeyed, and the way that 13 perceives any person that may have once been associated with an enemy. District 13 further extends a concerning and complete disregard for civilian life in times of war, with the proposed original siege of District 2 providing a terrifying glimpse into what they're willing to sacrifice. In Mockingjay, District 2 operates as the capital's greatest district asset as the district where the bulk of their weapons and military personnel are located. District 2 also poses a near identical problem to the one the capital did throughout the First Rebellion, in that the bulk of their soldiers and resources permanently reside in an impenetrable mountain base known as the Nut. Securing this base is essential to securing any sort of victory, but among the proposed and most seriously considered plans was triggering a purposeful avalanche that would kill any person inside. It takes Beedy's and Katniss's intervention to ensure an escape tunnel is left open, but the exchange that occurs in order to guarantee this is done insinuates that District 13 views the sacrifice of any civilian as worth the war's victory. District 13 generally appears to harbor the impression the ends justify virtually any means. Take a look at their willingness to implement Gale's double bombs, a technique purposely designed to disproportionately target citizenry and eliminate medical personnel. They utilized this technique at the expense of their own medical personnel at a point where the war was already essentially won, viewing it as a matter of pure efficiency purposes and little more. District 13 pedestals itself as the moral alternative to the capital's corrupt rule, the heart of rebellion itself and the antithesis to their oppressors' corruption, greed, and manipulation. However, it doesn't take much to peel away the mask of righteousness it so confidently showed to district refugees, revealing that beneath the surface, they are every bit as manipulative and cruel as the capital. Their leadership, the supposedly democratically elected Alma Coin, emphasizes the importance of liberation and justice for the districts, and yet, at the same time, fails to acknowledge to the people that 13's primary concern was securing power and control over the nation. Coin's methods, such as rationing food and maintaining total control over the flow of information in and out of District 13, reflects a regime that, despite its best efforts to con its citizens into believing otherwise, is just another corrupt entity more focused on consolidating authority than achieving true freedom for all citizens, district and capital alike. In Mockingjay, although it's a bit more difficult to immediately discern that there is a sinister undertone to the systems put in place in 13, it becomes glaringly obvious that they see themselves as the moral standard when held against the capital, while simultaneously remaining entirely removed from the horrifying reality of what it was truly like to live under the hand of President Snow. Their physical and psychological distance from the rest of Panem has left them unable to understand the complexities and nuances of life under the capital regime. While the districts were subject to diverse forms of oppression, from extreme poverty to forced labor to the spectacle of the games themselves, District 13's isolation has fostered a black and white view of the capital and anything remotely associated with it as an absolute evil that must be overthrown by any means necessary, even if it means innocent lives would be taken as a result. Because citizens lack a nuanced understanding of what life outside 13 is like, they also fail to understand and ultimately adapt to different forms of resistance, compromise, and survival that were imperative for members of the other districts. Instead, they treat the rebellion as a military strategy, devoid of the human dimensions that colored the experiences of the people who were actually living in Panem. Their dehumanization of district refugees is further examined with how quickly the refugees were integrated and expected to adapt and conform to the regimented society of District 13. From the moment they stepped into their territory, they were immediately subjected to the same rigid schedules, the same extremely controlled environments, the same painful, harsh punishments that ruled the citizens of 13. Their individual traumas and needs were never even an afterthought. Instead, they were forced to conform to a different flavor of the same militants that had shrouded every aspect of the lives they thought they had just escaped from. The fact that all of the capital and district citizens had just experienced the destruction of their homes and the loss of their loved ones was secondary to the primary goal of turning them into efficient, obedient, and submissive members of their society, just fresh cogs for the greater war machine. They failed to grasp the humanity of the rebellion and saw war purely through a lens of logistics, strategy, and numbers, instead of acknowledging the psychological scars that years of oppression and violence had left on the people of Panem. If you look at the way that 13 approaches reproduction, it only shines an even brighter light on their utilitarian and dehumanizing view of the refugees. Because of the pox epidemic that decimated their population, they were desperate to increase their numbers. The timing of when their numbers dramatically, irreparably decreased and when they decided to open up contact with the outside world was a strategic move, one reflective of authoritarianism rather than humanitarianism. They'd been carefully biding their time for decades, waiting for the perfect moment to re-enter the political arena. And, instead of dismantling the system the capital had put in place, simply opted to change the system's name and keep everything almost exactly the same. Their military assistance in the rebellion was, first and foremost, about positioning them as the new ruling power rather than supporting a revolution. The integration of district refugees hinged on their willingness to participate in rebuilding the ranks of 13. Not out of any desire to foster a sense of healthy community, but to ensure that they had the numbers to sustain themselves and fight the capital. Their reproductive control reduced the people of 13 and Panem alike to their biological functions, breeding stock to replenish an army. The women of District 12 in particular are deeply affected by this mentality, as they are not seen as individuals who had just suffered through the horrors of losing their homes and families, but as brood mothers of future District 13 soldiers. Instead of escaping the terror of being forced to watch their children potentially fight in a death arena, they would be forced to watch their future children suffer the same fate under the rule of a different maniacal dictator. 13's detachment also blinds them to the moral ambiguity that exists within the districts themselves. Survival comes with various prices, which sometimes means doing what was required to remain in good standing with the capital to protect oneself or even one's family, or by turning a blind eye to injustice in an effort to sustain one's own life. In the instance of 13, detachment has a hefty price as well, resulting in their inability to acknowledge the moral gray areas that come with surviving a violent dictatorship. And furthermore, their failure to understand the values of diplomacy or compromise. Compromise, to coin, was a weakness, and any hesitation was a betrayal to the cause. District 13's philosophies hinged on such a treacherously narrow tightrope that nobody who had ever only known their way of life could ever understand how complex life under the capital was, or the difficulty of the choices that had to be made, ones that could not necessarily be classified as right or wrong, or good or bad. Katniss herself was perfectly and intimately familiar with the idea of a moral compromise. She relied on a black market and formed alliances with peacekeepers just to get by. Coin, however, saw no such space for this. Her, and by default 13's worldview was shaped by a binary understanding of loyalty. You are either for or against the rebellion. If you ever once submit to anything the capital expects of you, regardless of whether or not you are forced to do so, like Peeta was, you are a treacherous criminal who deserves to be ostracized. This logic extends to the refugees from the capital. While they established themselves as the moral authority and liberators of Panem, they maintained a one-dimensional view of anything from the capital, which included the people who were trying to escape from it. From the bombing of the capital children to Coin's suggestion to form anew games using the capital's children to keep alive the morbid traditions of violence, every facet of how they functioned was only serving to hold up a mirror to the very system they claimed to be dismantling. This is the ultimate reason they cannot be allowed to secure power, because a 13 victory means essentially no victory was ever won, and this is precisely the reason that Katniss retaliates, leading to the true freedom her and her peers could have only previously fantasized about. Thank you so much for taking this tour of Panem with us, and if you enjoyed this video, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe. And here's an extra special thank you to our Patreons. What we do would not be possible without your support. If you would like to count yourself among them, the link is in the description. And an extra special thank you to the talented Emily Ann, who helped co-write the script. Her socials are also linked below. Thank you so much for your time, and have a fabulous day.